Hello, and welcome to Days of Future Past, Why Race Matters in Metadata, which is part of the DLF Forum Virtual Sessions this spring. My name is Aaliyah Reich. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the program manager for conferences and events at CLIR and DLF. I am delighted to welcome you to today's session. Before I invite our presenters to introduce themselves and we start the conversation, I'd like to remind attendees that we'll be following the Digital Library Federation Code of Conduct, which we'll place in the chat. Audience members, if you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the chat and feel free to chat with one another. We'll turn to questions and answers at the 45-minute mark of this 60-minute session, and we'll take the last question around 55 minutes past the hour. And without further ado, our presenters can take it away.
Right. My name is Julian Chambliss. I'm professor of English at MSU. I'm also the Val Berryman Curator of History here at MSU Museum. And I'm the faculty lead for the Graphic Possibilities Research Workshop. So I'm first up in our presentation, which the slides don't seem to be working. You want me to share, or are you good?
No, just one second. I pressed one wrong thing and now it's all chaos.
It's okay. I will start out by sort of giving an overview of the origins of this project. This is actually something that started out of, I always like to point out for students and colleagues, a failed grant exercise. So we can go to the next slide. Is it working? Oh, yeah. Originally, back in 2018, 2019, there was a call for collections as data part to the whole, a research project that was looking at collections as data. If you go to the next slide. We really saw this as an opportunity to think about our very unique collection at the MSU Library, the MSU Comic Art Collection. This is something that's been built over the last 35 years, primarily by Randall Scott, who's literally the librarian who wrote the book on comics and libraries. His sort of bibliographic project, sort of documenting comics, both in the United States and around the world. We actually have a very robust set of things from other parts of the world, but it's primarily a comic book collection that's associated with English-speaking world. Is a unique, reservoir of information for us. Thinking about something that is uniquely created out of the work of both scholars and librarians at our collection really opened up an opportunity. If you go to the next slide. Because the MSU Library already had an established sort of emphasis on data sets, you can see data set research when you go to the MSU Library. This was an opportunity for us to think about some of those, the sort of possibility of thinking through our comics collection in a similar way. So building on the fact that we have this sort of established practice in data sets and the fact we have a completely unique collection, we thought there was an opportunity to sort of pursue this grant. Go to the next slide. Obviously, some of the logics around this in terms of the collection of data are pretty straightforward. There are certain considerations, and we were particularly interested in the ways that we had these stacks and stacks of data. We had trustworthy data, and we had opportunity to envision some use cases that would spotlight important questions about comics, about culture, and really we saw, because of this established practice in terms of data set, a really ability to lower barriers of use around comics data. And comics isn't really thought about because it's a very visual medium. The data narratives around comics are very particular. I mean, this was an opportunity for us to sort of pursue a different pathway, keeping in our minds the ways that data allows us to manifest particular conversations about comics. Can you go to the next slide? This was a big project, and I always remember the very big table we sat around when we were talking about this. There were a number of people involved, and while we were able to look at our machine readable record, like the MARC record of the comics collection, pulling it out of the system also meant we had to clean that data. And I know Kate can talk more. We'll talk more specifics about some of the questions about that. We used we had a lot of conversations, and it really was a interdisciplinary group. I was a faculty person because I know comics as a research process, but there were a lot of librarians around the table, and there was a lot of conversation about the possibilities represented in pursuing this. You know, some of the questions were really forefront in my mind is, you know, how can we talk about how the comics industry has evolved over time? And in particular, because we were, you know, going through the process of cleaning the data, we really were adding things to the information and really trying to clarify important things about locality. To me, it was always a really important part of the conversation. And our hope was, could we see, you know, patterns of growth around communities of practice and where people are located, and really expand upon the narrative about locality and comics that are already established. Indeed, there are qualitative narratives about where comics are produced that are really sort of supported in the literature. But this was really an opportunity for us to think through having a sort of vast collection to like envision or vision other kinds of relationships that were not necessarily evident on the top of the page. Next slide, please. As you can see, when I think about this, I always like to go back to the fact, like, okay, we had to do the sort of hard work. Some of these questions really, in terms of adding information, were relatively simple. Other times they're more complicated. And one of the sort of recurring efforts here was to try to think about what are the best ways to sort of reconcile some of the sort of patterns in the data with some of our goals that we had in terms of trying to create a data set that could be used in an ethical manner, and to sort of really call attention to some of those questions that we had. Go to the next slide. So since we got through that project, we did not get the grant, obviously, but we did continue on to get to what is the data set that we just were referring to as Comics as Data in North America, which is a mere 50,000 lines of records. That is North America, right? So it's not the entire collection. It was our intent at the time that we're just going to identify North America as our working data set and attempt to clean it. Once we did not get the grant, we continued on to complete a sort of working data set that you can now download from that same page that I showed you earlier, you know, data sets at MSU Library. But in our kind of debrief and rethinking of like, what was it that we learned from this, there were clearly some data opportunities that were available to us. And so we've really leveraged the establishment of the data set as a way to sort of pursue thinking about data sets and thinking about comics in the classroom. And in particular, we've pursued a Wikidata editathon cycle, primarily because we recognized there was an ability for us to use our data set to really add it to the open link data environment in a way that was meaningful. You can go to the next slide. In order to do that, I really sort of facilitating that through the Graphic Possibilities Research Workshop, which is a research workshop in the English department. Ironically, while the library has a really strong community, really strong tradition around data sets, at some level, all the work around data is not one person's job. It is facilitated by communal action. So the Graphic Possibility Workshop has sort of stepped in to become the kind of driver, and it's under that rubric that we have supported the Wikidata editathons that have worked across campuses to sort of add information to Wikidata, and you can find out more about this on our website. I think for me personally, one of the things I am sort of driven by is the possibility of thinking about data, and this really was one of the things that became clear as we were working with Wikidata, thinking about the ways that data allowed us to think through questions of identity. And if you go to the next slide, for myself, I'm really sort of building on this idea of Kim Gowan, who really called for a kind of Black digital humanities, and her approach is really highlighting a way that technology can be employed to look at underexamined contexts and the ways that technology helps to sort of racialize us, or it helps in the construction of race. So I think my final slide here. Ultimately, when Kim Gowan was talking about this, she talked about the Black digital humanity reflects less actual thing and more of a constructed space to consider intersection between digital and Blackness. I think ultimately one of the things that has become consistent in our work with the Comics Day of North America is the ways that we can call attention to the institutional data and how it shapes our understanding of experiences around race and identity and community in particular. And as we can continue to pursue this work, we're really emphasizing the ways that we can reread the collection and really interrogate the data to create opportunities to understand. So from my perspective as sort of the origins of the project, I think we continue to pursue some of those initial goals around trying to understand the ways that the collection provides clarity on really complex issues that are hidden in culture and can be made more visible through our kind of data approach. So I'll leave it there and let my colleagues talk more specifically about the work that we've done recently with the collection.
Okay, so I'll hop in. So a lot of this work, we should mention, comes out of an article we published in Genealogy about the intersection of comics and race and metadata. Myself and my colleagues Nicole and Justin each have a case study that was kind of our little piece of it. So we'll turn to kind of each of our case studies now. So to introduce myself really quickly, I'm Kate Topham. I'm the Digital Humanities Archivist at Michigan State University, which means I work in our little DH at MSU office where we support digital humanities work broadly defined. I do a lot of stuff with metadata is basically what that means. So in looking at this data set, I wanted to specifically look at the subject headings. How do we use those as data? Can we use them as data? What does that mean? Next slide, please, Nicole. Thanks. So I combed through our metadata to just see what kind of terms are being used to describe ethnicity and how many we have that fit in certain buckets. I want to emphasize at the start that this is an extremely flawed methodology, and these are not my original terms because we're working with the Library of Congress subject headings, and it's just in general not great. All of this indicates usages of terms around African American or Black identity, et cetera, et cetera. So it includes both general terms like African Americans and also specific terms like Black Muslims or Latino teachers, that kind of thing. So particularly, I want to point out that the Indigenous or American Indian column is very problematic because the word Indians is used throughout, like the Library of Congress subject headings, which are used in our collection to describe both people indigenous to the U.S. And their descendants and people who reside in or have ancestry on the Indian subcontinent. I intentionally didn't resolve that within this data, mostly because it wouldn't have been scalable given the size of the collection, but also because it highlights the problems and racism inherent in our data. But here in the table, you can see the number of comics given terms relating to African American or Black was 433, Asian American 15, Indigenous or American Indian 224, Latin American, Latino or Latina 22, and just one for white or white American. Next slide. When we plot these frequencies by year, we can see that other than one exception in 1902, these terms don't really start being applied to comics until the mid-1900s. That could signal simply that there are more diverse identities being represented in comics at this time, but this increase also tracks with the rise of movements against racism and towards civil rights, as well as the rise in popularity of comics in general. So we can see a huge spike in comics with terms around Black identities in the early 90s and the mid-aughts through to 2020s, periods when discourse around race and racism, particularly the experiences of Black people, were what's much more prominent. So I'm sure you're all wondering, what is that one single comic identified as white American? Next slide. The comic in question is entitled Your Black Friend by Ben Passmore, published by Silver Sprocket in 2016. It's an 11-page comic zine written in the second person. It's an open letter on race and being Black in America. This comic is also assigned the subject headings group identity, race relations, African Americans, friendship, and racism. So the only time that white identity is noted in our catalog is when it's placed in opposition to another racial group. Representation of white people individually and as groups undoubtedly appear in the catalog, but catalogers don't note this in the subject field. We could say, oh, all the catalogers are racist, but that's not super useful, and there's something much bigger going on here. Next slide. So as we all know, since many of you are in library contexts, racism is embedded in every level of our society, and the catalog is no different. This has been extensively covered by scholars like Melissa Alder, Hope Olson, and Sanford Berman, among many others, but I would be remiss if I didn't, at least talk about it here a little bit. Next slide. So we can trace this kind of erasure, this kind of othering of racial groups back to Charles Cutter, who's an early librarian. I don't like to give that term to him, but here we are. But Melissa Adler in her research traces the history back to him, and he wrote these works, Rules for a Dictionary Catalog and an Unfinished Expansive Classification, which serve as models for the modern classification systems like the Library of Congress classification system. He took an evolutionary approach to classification, and if that doesn't make your skin crawl, I don't know what will. But he placed subjects both within and outside of natural sciences in a hierarchy as they would naturally evolve. So for example, he put the subject term Freeman Negroes within education at the end, at the bottom, along with other marginalized groups. So completely distinct from classes that are devoted to topics related to education, pedagogy, school subjects, grade levels, etc., because we have to put people of non-white identities at the end, I guess, because there's no pedagogy for them. So there's this kind of assumed white, able-bodied, male, propertied American person that the catalog is designed for. There's this presumption of objectivity that Charles Cutter had, being, a white, propertied American man. And that continues today. Next slide. So it's clear that some of that has trickled down into our catalog. We know that there are more representations of white people than appear in this table and this graph, but the subject terms just don't reflect that, and that reinforces the marginalization of people of color in our catalog. Next slide. So if you're a big metadata nerd, you might know what I'm talking about here, but this comes from a fundamental issue with using subject headings as data. In general, subject headings are used to communicate to users what a document is about, or so in this case, what a comic is about. So what we call aboutness, determining the aboutness of a comic. In our catalog, we have mostly is about, but we also have instance of subject headings. So there are over 4,000 comics that have subject headings that include the word horror. Most of these comics are instances of comics within the horror genre, which Nicole will talk about later, but it also includes volumes that talk about the history of horror comics as a genre. So it can make it difficult to tease out whether a representation is respectful or harmful. It's hard to see it's hard to see how that representation works. Is this comic about African American people? Is this about Black people? Or is it just there are Black people in this comic? We don't want to necessarily do that, so it makes it hard to see that representation. Next slide. So as far as racism itself is concerned, subject headings seem to be only applied. These subject headings seem to be only applied to comics about racism rather than instances of racism in comics. The comics bearing the term racism start in around in the 1960s and go up a lot more in the 1990s. The more euphemistic and archaic term race relations starts a little bit earlier and goes up even more. And so they kind of follow similar patterns. Next slide. But the other subject headings within this subset of comics that discuss, that are tagged with racism or race relations as terms, the phrase civil rights appears 21 times, history appears 20 times, and African American appears 32 times. So there's, this bears out the hypothesis that most of these comics are about racism, about race relations, rather than instances of racism, which I could show a lot of examples. There are undoubtedly instances of racism in comics within the catalog, but because of the way subject headings are, the way that they work, the way they're intended to work, it makes it harder to see racial identity in the catalog. Next slide. So once again, catalog is racist. The objectivity myth and the aboutness problem make it really hard to look at subject headings as a representation of race in comics. But these subject headings also reveal broad trends within comics, and along with the rise of comics and how we mediate identity in like visual media, visual culture. But at the same time, all the description of race within our catalog presents non-white identities as others, and racism is a problem for minorities. But it's also a view that we don't otherwise get. So the subject headings are problematic, but they do provide an inroad to this data that we don't otherwise have. To examine the evolution of discourse on race in America and evolutions in race representation within the medium of comics, for better and for worse. And that's my bit.
And now on to my bit. I'm Nicole Huff. I'm a PhD candidate at Michigan State in the English department. In my area of specialty is looking at Black women in particular and Black queer folks in horror, kind of across genre or across mediums. So I look at comics as well. And as Julian kind of mentioned in the very beginning, talking about like the origin of this project, our work with Wikidata and finding new ways to enrich our comic metadata by creating these visualizations is just kind of the conversation starter around identity and representation in comics as data. So I, of course, focus on the horror genre. Ooh. All right. So when we consider the history of comics as well as of the horror genre, it's pretty well known that the genre as well as the medium have particular ways of representing Black individuals as well as other people of color, as well as their narratives. So I have this like little like sub quote from Francis Gateway and John Jennings, in which they describe in Black or the Ink that comics traffic in stereotypes as well as they work to abstract and simplify. So in other words, representations of Black people and other people of color in comics, especially in the horror genre, which has historically been not great at representing Black people and people of color, as it often traffics in those stereotypes. And so there's a history that is rooted in stereotypes as well as in simplifying the experiences and narratives of marginalized groups. So my case study kind of looks to explore the horror comics in our catalog and how visualizing them can further the conversation about the history of comics in relation to race, as well as in relation to the horror genre. So just bear with me. I had to take like a couple screenshots of mine, but at the end you'll see like you can go to like the story of it and you can like actually tinker with this and move it around. But the data used to create this visualization only considers horror comics from our comic art collection. that includes horror authors and dates assigned to them, tagged with the description of horror or horror comics as the item's first descriptive tag. After like cleaning through all of it and getting it down to just the horror comics in our collection, there were 4,394 comics in the collection tagged as horror or horror comics. But only 1,255 of those items had authors and dates assigned to them. So that was what was used to create this. This visualization was created to depict the amount of horror comics in the comic arts collection in a hierarchical circle chart, where the usable data is grouped by author with their attributed works from the collection included in their respective circles. This, when you interact with it, you can also sort it out by year of publication. But in all instances, what happens is the largest circles are pulled towards the middle of the visualization, and those largest circles are essentially showing who has the most attributed works in the collection. So as you can see, Mike Mignola is pretty clear in our collection as the most represented. And then you can see Steve Niles. It should also note that their names only show up if they have enough attribution to be in the middle like this. So there are tons of others, but as you see, as they get smaller, they get pushed out further and further. So went through those data. So Mike Mignola had 74 items attributed to him. I don't even think that definitely saw stuff without his name attributed to it that is his in the catalog. So it's still like just a matter of, it takes time to clean all of this and add all of that data. But Mike Mignola had 74 items assigned to him, and the most second represented creator, Steve Niles, had 30 items, which places them at the center of that visual. And while these are white creators, they do at times take up semi-racial narratives through their use of mythology and folklore. Specifically, Mike Mignola often adopts Irish and Russian folklore to explore and critique mythology and historical events. And while this is good that these narratives exist, it still has to be problematized that the horror comics with the most representation are created by white authors, and those comics only and mostly consist of Anglo narratives. So then when you want to look a little bit closer at other works, what you have to do is you actually have to hover over all these circles that you can't see the name in order to see their name. So when you hover over, this is how you get Junji Ito. So Junji Ito is actually the most notable person of color contributor in the visual. Junji Ito is the author of Uzumaki, Spiral into Horror, and has gained a lot of popularity over the last few years, but they only have a total of 6 items attributed to them. And so the author is pulled towards the center of this visual, but it's still largely unnoticeable, right? Like I mentioned, you still have to hover over it. I tried to take like a screenshot of when I hovered over it, but you have to still hover over it to even get Junji Ito's name to pop up. And it is probably the most Junji Ito's representation is probably the most space taken up in the visual by a BIPOC creator, despite there being others in the collection. Again, like I said, largely unnoticeable, pushed towards the margin, and it kind of shows like physically how the marginalization is taking place, right? So BIPOC authors do not take up a noticeable amount of space in this subset of the collection unless one knows BIPOC horror authors' works and publication dates. With that prior knowledge, one can sort the visual by publication year to more easily find BIPOC authors. However, when you look at all, which is what I had those screenshots of, like when you're looking at all publication years, the most notable BIPOC author is Junji Ito. And despite them being centered, they're still very silenced, right? There we go. From this visualization, we concluded that there is a trend in horror comics of silencing or displacing the voices of marginalized people, which isn't very surprising. The visualization can be read, again, as a metaphor for author representation in horror comics, the white voices being centered, their names being shown, while BIPOC voices are silenced and literally pushed to the margins of the visual. While those with the most representation, the white author works, are centered. There is a lacking representation of horror comics created by BIPOC authors in this data set, despite the growing number of BIPOC authors in horror comics overall. Thinking of like John Jennings, who should probably be in this catalog, things like that. John Jennings, again, Junji Ito has more works. So it's just kind of that imperfectness of the like the subject headings and whatnot that Kate was talking about, but specifically in this genre. I also want to connect this back to what Julian was saying earlier with the Kim Gallen quote, which is very interesting because I had that exact quote in a different slide and I actually got rid of it because I didn't know if it was going to be going on a tangent. So here we go. But really, I'm thinking about one of the big takeaways from this project was not only highlighting like the clear marginalization of BIPOC creators in the horror genre, and especially in comics, but it's also a simultaneous recovery of those works, bringing them into the center, pointing out their marginalization, but trying to find new ways to represent them in this visual. So it's kind of that recovery project and retelling a history of comics where it's like, yes, they're there. They're not as easy to find in the catalog, but they're there and what's important about their narratives. So yeah, that's my bit, and I will pass it over to Justin.
Hi, everyone. I think we need to.
Something just went weird.
Yeah, there we go. Good. Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Wigard. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Richmond, where I do work on comic studies and digital humanities. But I was up until recently at Michigan State University, helping everyone out and working in the Graphic Possibilities Research Workshop. So today I'm going to be talking about another case study on graphic indigeneity. And in his book, Native Americans in Comic Books, Indigenous comic scholar Michael Shayasi highlights the comic arts collection as a strong resource for scholars and fans alike interested in Indigenous representation in comics to use as a foundation for comics research. This is due in no small part to the breadth of the comic book archives, which I feel like we're contractually obligated to say has over 300,000 comics. I can't believe I haven't said that before, but it also has these incredible vertical files of collected materials and ephemera on popular topics related to comic book research, right? Clippings, advertising materials, greeting cards, work samples, and miscellanea. Germane to this discussion, kind of why I bring it up, is that there's this incredible vertical file on Native American images in comics, and that's in quotes, one of the vertical file titles, which is this rich trove of items that is and will continue to be a great boon to comic scholars. However, the collection is so firmly tied to MSU's physical campus in East Lansing, Michigan, that there have been multiple attempts to kind of extend that collection outward to a much larger audience, like some of the case studies we're working on today. Most notably, Randall Scott's online textual database, which is really extensive, but a little bit dense to break into if you're not familiar with what you're looking for. Shayashi also notes that, and he hopes for, and this is back in 2008 that he's writing this book, he hopes for a digital extension of the comic arts collection in the future as a supplement to that database. And specifically, he wants this extension for something connected to this Native American in comic books sort of vertical file, right? In 2008, he's calling for like a digital repository of the comics, like scans, which would be a great boon, but is impractical for 8,000 reasons due to copyright laws and logistics, right? So instead, what I want to go through, and I think you can skip to the next slide, Nicole. What I want to go through is my project that takes his call seriously in its attempts to try to extend that collection outward to related to graphic indigeneity. And it also addresses that tiny block of data that Kate was actually talking about with about like 200 items with the Indigenous subject heading. And I'm going to kind of talk about that tiny little block and why it's so significant. The showcase that I'll get into has two primary visualizations with a planned third viz. The first one is this robust interactive archive of covers from comics that have the Indigenous subject heading tag from our data set. And the second one that I put together is this interactive time-based pie graph that kind of shows the evolution of the data set with those Indigenous comics. The showcase is guided by the work of comic scholar Frederick Louis Aldama's notion of graphic indigeneity, but it also follows in the footsteps of folks like Camille Callison, who is Talton, Nagan Woodham Sinclair, who is Anishinaabe, and Greg Bach's excellent work on Indigenous comics archives. Aldama writes that the goal of graphic indigeneity, both in his edited collection and methodological framework itself, is to, quote, throw scholarly light on how mainstream comics have clumsily, mostly distilled and reconstructed indigenous identities and experiences of Terra, America, and Australia. And this is key, to spotlight how indigenous comic book creators are themselves creating new visual verbal narrative spaces for articulating more complex histories, cultures, experiences, and identities. Callison, Sinclair, and Bach also kind of echo this call in many ways, further focused on archival practices, stating that indigenous comics need to be discussed and shown in all of their forms. Graphic narratives created by First Nations people, but also comics that present complex depictions of indigenous peoples by non-indigenous creators, and even historical ones that are stereotypical in their portrayals, right? We kind of need the good, the bad, and the ugly in this way. Next slide, please. This archival showcase has multiple stages and digital visualization supported. So in the first stage, comics that were tagged with that indigenous mark record identifier in our database were selected from the data set and then uploaded into this initial digital product showcase. I think we can actually go into the next slide from here, Nicole. Thank you. Let's see here. So this visualization is that pie graph, and if you go to this website, you can see it. Essentially, what this visualization shows is the number of indigenous comics that were published like in a given year, as well as you can kind of see like how that grows over time, as far as from I think it's like late 1800s on through the present. I think that there are more interesting ways that I could show this, and I kind of want to explore this in the future, but this is sort of the one that made sense to me at the time. Next slide, please. This is the visualization that I think I'm more excited about, because I think it's the one that I really takes kind of acts on Shayashi's call in a pretty important way, I think. Here I try to put together all of those that entire block of indigenous comics, and then I worked with a lot of the librarians in the Michigan State Library to actually get scans of those specific comics, and then uploaded them to this interactive cover, or in this interactive showcase. So if you go to the website, you can see a lot of these, and you can also see spaces where those where comics don't have covers because they were either like newspaper clippings or items in the vertical file in some ways, or maybe we just weren't able to get a comics cover for whatever reason. Well, here we go. So each of these covers were carefully and graciously scanned in by MSU librarians and archivists. And we chose these covers for a couple of primary reasons. The first is really practical. Copyright laws and protections prevent in-depth scanning and uploading of interior art for these comics, right? And so this is kind of a boon, and why I'm really excited about this is because Randall Scott's textual database just sort of shows a lot of like really helpful metadata, but doesn't show kind of like what you're looking for. And so this acts as a really, I think, important supplement to encourage visitors to visit the special collection and to continue learning from the experts who also work intimately with those comics. The second is kind of practical. Comic book covers are just significant windows of representation, right? In the same way that like book covers are. They are very often the first things that we see, and especially in terms of like a lot of the historical depictions of indigenous folk, they're like snapshots into how that representation is so concretized and permanent in those covers, especially in like the older comics, or they're like these very realistic painted depictions, and I think it's really important. But the showcase also highlights covers by indigenous creators, as well as those entries by non-indigenous folks who mostly managed to get graphic indigeneity right, aligning with both Aldama's call as well as that of Callison, Sinclair, and Bach. And so our data set, as we talked about earlier, doesn't have the entirety of the comic arts collection within it, but even so, it still acts as a snapshot of the collection as a whole, as well as of American comics history. And so out of about 50,000 lines in our data set, less than 1% have this indigenous tag, and that's also probably pretty accurate for North American comics history, writ large, right? And so of course, the library science behind Randy Scott's database, the heart of this data set, in truth, is really robust and comprehensive, and it's aimed at reaching a large audience of comic scholars and educators who most likely have intimate knowledge of the medium and its history, right? And so not all entries within the comic arts collection have every possible cataloging tag applied, which would just be unwieldy and impossible to truly implement, right? So when you look at this data set, this visualization, you end up seeing some pretty notable gaps in comics record, right? You might be looking for, I don't know, Silver Age comics publishers like Dell and Gold Key, trying to find comics like Turok, Son of Stone, or maybe more comics about a title named White Eagle, Indian Chief. And so this gap is largely due to the construction of, the CADNet data set, but also just because some of those comics end up having more prominent categorical headings, right? Like some of these might be categorized under like the Western genre, or they might be categorized under, like other sorts of historical markers. So this kind of gap only greatens the need to highlight these comics that do have the indigenous tag at present. Next slide, please. The third and final stage of this showcase that I'm putting together, let's just say number 3, that's on my fault. It involves uploading biographical information for indigenous authors and linking directly to their publicly available professional portfolios if they exist, and trying to provide key context for their comics that are within our data set. The goal here is to first and foremost platform the work of indigenous creators and highlight the work within the collection. And as a land-grant university, Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. And so the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. So in accordance, those working at MSU, as well as those working with its outputs, like the MSU Comics data set, like the 4 of us, have an obligation to enact imperative work to offer support, to highlight indigenous voices, perspectives, and experiences. So part of the major, I think, like chunk of what I'll be working on this summer is trying to really build this platform, this carousel that platforms those creators and then connects outwards. And so this showcase is ongoing and it's incomplete, but I think it's a really exciting one because it also is going to allow for, again, trying to connect the collection with this call that comic scholars have been calling for 15 years, at least in the case of Michael Shiashi, for greater representation and support for those working in indigenous comic studies especially. But it also sort of supplements a lot of really important ongoing digital data visualization work. And so hopefully this ongoing showcase will aid in discovering indigenous comics at MSU and abroad. And I think that by continuing to create these sorts of digital showcases, these sorts of case studies and archives of graphic narratives, and also really kind of pushing at thinking about comics as data and comics as data sets in particular, we can kind of continue developing these ongoing conversations and studies of these incredibly necessary visual records of cultural history and identity and race and representation. And with that, I think I'm all set. I'll gladly just say thank you on behalf of everyone here, and we're very happy to field any and all questions, comments, and inquiries. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much for those great presentations, folks. Attendees, if you'd like to ask any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And while we're waiting for any of those to come in, I don't know, presenters, if you have any questions for each other, or if there's anything that you weren't able to get to in your presentations, that it was like, oh, it didn't just quite make the cut, or anything else that's sort of important to this conversation.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, since we put this presentation together, the job has now come out for the new comic studies librarian. So if anyone out there in the audience is super excited about comics, you can come work with us, and I'll put the job ad in the chat. Since Randy has retired, we are in the market. So please come work with us.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think one of the things that we are continuing to think about is sort of connected to the idea that our approach to our data curation, our ways of thinking about the comic art collection and the legacies of Randy's sort of bibliographic list are really open, right? Those are ongoing conversations at some level when I think about this particular project, this particular article, one of the goals was to try to think through, are there different kinds of narratives that we can elicit from the collection? And that that is an ongoing process. So the one thing I would always say to people, the data set is available. So if you're interested in seeing what you can do with the data, we have a recurring set of conversations about we need to do more in terms of just the raw organization of the data. Some of the things that you're seeing here, our use of Flourish, for instance, is really a very deliberate attempt on our part to lower the barriers to entry for users. So I think we've all used the data set in class and had undergraduate students using it, in part because we want to build their sort of data literacy and talk to them about some of the same issues that we talked about today. I think we all have different experiences where we're trying to allow people to recognize the sort of complex set of narratives that are elicited through a kind of data conversation. So for people out there who have data conversation they want to pursue, I really do want to encourage you to take the data set and do something with it. And please let us know, because we're always interested in the ways that people can tell stories with the data set.
We do have a question from the chat. It's a really good one. Do you have plans for reparative metadata work based on what you learned from this analysis from this project overall?
Well, I won't speak for everyone, but I think one of the things that drives our approach to engaging with Wikidata is exactly that. Part of our challenge when we're talking about our data set, or really any kind of institutional data, are what are the tools that are available for you to make changes. So in the context of the library, there's not a lot of tools. Well, okay. Well, as not someone who's not a librarian, there are not necessarily an infinite number of ways to go back into the data repository and make these changes. One of the reasons that we have committed to a Wikidata approach is that there are very low barriers to entry in terms of adding more contextual data, right? And our first cycle was about just simply recognizing that there are gaps in the data record that we can address through a Wikidata editathon, and that working with the world's, basically the world's largest open linked data repository is our attempt to try to provide those opportunities to create greater clarity, greater diversity, greater accuracy.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say, we, like many institutions, we would love to have more, do a reparative metadata project on these comics. But if you want to give us that money, we would be happy for you to fund a project like that. It would take, the collection is huge, just the North America section of it is 50,000 records, and there's a ton more. So there's a lot of work to do on that side, and most of our sorry, lost my train of thought. But there's most of our records, I remembered, sorry, most of our records come from the OCLC. We have a few terms that were applied by librarians, by Randy Scott generally, but none of them have to do with racial identity. It's all funny animal comics is one of our subject headings that's not within the Library of Congress. But a lot of the records that we have come from the OCLC. So making systemic change, we'd have to go back and do some of that work at the OCLC level.
Nicole, did you want to go? I had a thought, but I wanted to give you space.
Kate beat me to my thought, which was that would be a great project. And if anyone's willing to fund it, that would be good. We would all do it. But yeah, that was all I had to.
For what it's worth, and kind of echoing, like kind of expanding a little bit on like what Julian was saying. We've held these semesterly Wikidata workshops where we partner with a lot of like folks from all over, especially not just scholars and specialists, but like independent experts outside of the academy, which is a really important thing. And a lot of those have been in some ways like just uploading that metadata to Wikidata is like an act of like reparation itself, you know, like making it open and linked in a huge way, and basically trying to break down a lot of like the silos around our data set, even though it's open and access, right? Like it's a lot of it is still just housed at MSU. And so kind of making it open access is huge. But also really trying to focus on like when we do some of those Wikidata events and also creating our visualizations, we're actively trying to spotlight BIPOC creators and marginalized narratives. And that also is important to kind of challenging the dominant narratives around, you know, especially like for our case, comics data, right? Like comics history for so long has just been incredibly white and very whitewashed at that way too. So like anytime we can create these visualizations, or anytime that we can particularly upload a lot of chunks of Wikidata for, you know, BIPOC creators or queer cartoonists, those sorts of things, it ends up enacting some of that reparative work too. And there's always more work to be done. There's always more case studies to be done too, but it helps.
Great. And I do want to acknowledge, it looks like it was answered in the chat, but just so that it makes it into the recording, there was a question about what software was used to create the visual representations, and they look really nice.
Yeah, sorry. We use Flourish, which is a web-based platform that has templates. So as long as your data is in like CSV files, as long as it's structured, you can use Flourish. That was a very deliberate choice to make it as easy as possible to create something. We could talk, I think, endlessly about some of the sort of technical conversations that we have. I joke with Kate that she's engineering, like, you know, if this was a ship, like she's engineering department. But when we're trying, especially in the context of the classroom, to get students involved and thinking through and utilizing, we are always trying to make sure that we can lower the barrier. And so Flourish becomes a way for us to lower the barrier. You know, you can sort of concentrate on creating the working subset of the data that you want to use in a classroom, and really walk students through the choices necessary to create sort of informational visualizations.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I found Flourish is great when we're thinking it. It's a great tool to use when we're trying to get students to pick up data literacy skills, just because you have to do the math yourself. Justin's laptop died, I think. But you have to do some of that data wrangling and a little bit of math before it goes into Flourish a lot of times. And that can be really instructive to have to do that work yourself.
Great. Well, I think since I don't see any other questions, might be a good opportunity to go ahead and wrap up. So thank you so much to our presenters and our attendees for this wonderful session. We'll be sharing a recording of this session on the CLIR and DLF YouTube channel in the coming weeks, so look out for that. As a last reminder, our calls for proposals for our in-person events coming up this fall in St. Louis are open through May 1st, and we've just put the link in the chat there so you can review those and submit proposals for our events in November. And with that, thanks again to our presenters and to all of our attendees, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.